Hello, my name is Andy Fry and welcome to this, the third in a series of pre-recorded LGA webinars exploring the governance role of Fire and Rescue Authority members in England. The first webinar in the series provided a fairly general high-level overview of the governance role that you all have as FRA members. The second webinar focused specifically on the responsibility that you have for overseeing the performance of your fire and rescue services. And this third session continues that theme of specific focus by examining what I think is a really important governance consideration for you as FRA members. And that is, how can you exercise your political governance role really effectively throughout the process of your fire and rescue services, firstly preparing for, and then if necessary, responding to and recovering from really major emergencies or other significant crises that have a very substantial impact on the service. And we're going to approach that question from a particular perspective. And that's because, unlike most organisations, by their very nature as emergency responders, your fire and rescue services are really well used to dealing with emergencies and other crises as just a routine part of their day-to-day business as usual. However, at times, the sheer scale, the nature, and or the duration of a major emergency can be so significant that it's got the potential to undermine the ability of your fire and rescue service to deal with that major emergency, and in parallel with that, to continue to deliver all the other important work for which it's responsible for. So at the heart of this webinar, we're talking about business continuity. And as an extension of the challenges that those kind of scenarios can create for your fire and rescue services, they can also raise questions about the ability of fire and rescue authorities to continue to exercise their really important governance role, and in particular to oversee the ongoing discharge of the long list of statutory responsibilities for which you're responsible. So I think we're trying to address over the next half an hour what is a really important governance question for all of you as FRA members. In terms of what we are going to cover, well, the high level purpose of the webinar is really to provide you with some food for thought, some practical ideas on the sorts of things you should be considering to exercise effective governance through the process of your services preparing for, responding to and recovering from major emergencies. As far as the specific content is concerned, well, the webinar really breaks into two parts. The first part is looking at some theory. First of all, by setting the governance role that you all have as FRA members in relation to major crises within the context of your broader governance responsibilities. We're then going to have a look at the various stages of an emergency management cycle throughout which you will need to continue to exercise good governance. And then we'll finish the theory section by looking at the specific responsibility that you as FRA members have for business continuity under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. Then we move from theory into what's probably the more important part of the webinar, practical application. We're going to do that by returning to the various stages of the emergency management cycle to think about the sorts of things that you might do to exercise effective governance. Firstly, by securing assurance that your fire and rescue services are really well prepared for major crises. Then exercising governance when they're called upon to respond all the way through that response phase, and then continuing into the process of exercising effective governance during recovery from a major emergency after the response has been dealt with, and then also learning available lessons from the experience of having dealt with that emergency, which fits under the heading of mitigation. So we're going to spend a few minutes on that. Okay, let's start with a quick look at a little bit of theory. And to do that, we're going to cover quite quickly some of the ground that we looked at in a lot more detail during the first two webinars, starting at that top level around the governance role that you have as fire and rescue authorities. As far as your headline responsibilities is concerned, they really fit, they crystallise into three key areas. The first is the really important role that you have in determining that high level strategic policy agenda for your fire and rescue services. Having done that, you've got an important role in setting an appropriate budget to fund delivery of that policy agenda. And then the third area of responsibility that you have, which is really important, is about undertaking scrutiny, introducing constructive challenge, critical friendship to satisfy yourselves that the outcomes that you've set as being important are being achieved by your fire and rescue services efficiently, effectively, and in accordance with any statutory requirements. So there's the headline responsibilities. In terms of how you exercise them, good practice suggests that there are a number of principles that public sector organisations like FRAs need to keep in mind when they're dealing with those headline responsibilities. And they are set out in this model that comes from an international framework for good governance. In aggregate, these 7 principles are intended to help public sector organisations to achieve the outcomes that they've set out to achieve while acting in the public interest at all times. At the centre of the model, there are 2 behaviourally orientated principles. So this is the acting in the public interest at all times aspect. And in the UK, I think this is discharged through the well-established now Nolan principles, of which I'm sure you are all well aware. So there they are on the left-hand side, the 7 principles that people in positions of public life need to adhere to make certain that they're acting in the public interest at all times. On the outside of the model, we've got the remaining 5 principles, which are action orientated and are very much focused on making sure that intended outcomes are achieved. And we start in the top right hand segment by working with your officer colleagues to define the high level outcomes that you want your fire and rescue services to achieve. Having done that, you determine what needs to be done to achieve those intended outcomes. So in particular, this will be about the offer, the services that you provide across prevention, protection and response. We then move to a principle that's about making sure that your fire and rescue service is fit for purpose by building the necessary capacity and capability it needs to deliver those services and achieves the outcomes that have been set. Then there is a principle about managing the kind of risks that have the potential to knock you off course and stop you from achieving what you want to, and a more general point about the role that you have in overseeing the performance of your fire and rescue service, identifying good practice where it emerges, but also making sure that corrective action is taken if you're not on the right trajectory to achieve the things that you set out to achieve. And then the final principle is really important, and it's about reporting on what you've achieved and doing it in a really open, transparent and honest way. Now, the arrows within this model are attempted to illustrate that this is an ongoing cyclical process, which if done well should lead to the continuous improvement in the performance of your fire and rescue services. So there's a little bit on your 3 headline responsibilities: to set the policy agenda for your service, to set the budget to pay for its delivery, and then to undertake scrutiny to make sure that that policy agenda is being delivered really well. And in the process of discharging those responsibilities, you need to keep the 7 principles that are on the screen on this slide in mind. For the purposes of this webinar, the principle that we're really interested in is this one here, and in particular, the requirement for public sector organisations to manage risks that have got the potential to knock them off course. With all the best planning in the world, there is always the potential that there will be not necessarily unanticipated events, but certainly highly unwelcome events of the sort Harold Macmillan spoke about all those years ago. And from the perspective of this webinar, when we think of events of risks, we're thinking specifically about business continuity risks. What are the things that could happen that could prevent you and your fire and rescue service from delivering the really important business that you exist to deliver? And in order to manage business continuity risks really well, you need to think about the kind of scenarios that might come into play. So I think business continuity risk can come into play in 3 scenarios. The first is where your fire and rescue service is responding to a really major emergency, and the extent of the resources that are being deployed to deal with that emergency denude the resources that are available for dealing with other really important service delivery. So that creates a business continuity issue. The second scenario is where a major crisis is directly impacting on your service. So you're not necessarily responding to it, but you're being impacted upon by a major crisis, and that is depleting your human and or other resources. And a really topical example of that would be pandemic illness. If there's an outbreak of pandemic illness that makes a significant proportion of your fire and rescue services workforce too unwell to come to work, and clearly that generates quite a significant business continuity risk. And the third scenario is a combination of the first two. Unlikely, but nevertheless realistic. It's possible that at the same time as you're investing huge resources in dealing with a major response to a significant emergency, something else could come in from left field, which also impacts on the amount of resource that you've got available to continue with the really important business for which you're responsible. And in order to manage business continuity risks really well in each of those three scenarios, you need to think about dealing with risk in an integrated way. And that's done by managing it through each of the stages that comprise what's known as an emergency or a crisis management cycle. This is how you achieve an integrated approach to managing down business continuity and other kinds of risk. And there are 4 phases in this integrated emergency management model. The first of which is focused on preparedness, being prepared for something to go wrong. And there are 4 aspects to preparedness. The first is about using your imaginations to anticipate the kind of things that could go wrong. Having done that, to make an assessment of how likely it is that that bad thing is going to happen, and if so, what would the consequences of it be? Having carried out an assessment, you then turn your attention to thinking about how you can prevent the thing from going wrong by taking necessary steps. And then the fourth element in preparedness is about accepting that with all the best anticipation, assessment and prevention work in the world, there's still a chance that that bad thing might happen, that risk may manifest itself and you end up with a significant emergency or other crisis that's got business continuity implications, and you therefore need to plan for how you mitigate the impact of those sorts of emergencies and crises. So they're the 4 stages of preparedness, and really, as you can imagine, very important. So important, in fact, that for a critical public service like fire and rescue, the ability, the requirement to carry out really effective preparedness work is enshrined in law in the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. Now, under the Civil Contingencies Act, fire and rescue authorities are designated as something called Category 1 responders. So alongside ambulance and police, the other blue light services, local authorities, the NHS and the Environment Agency, organisations that have got a centrally important role in dealing with major emergencies, the CCA requires all of those organisations to cooperate and to work together to plan how to prevent things going wrong if possible, and then beyond that, how they'll mitigate the impact of a major emergency should it happen. So there's a common set of responsibilities for all those Category 1 responders under the Civil Contingencies Act. And within the list, there is a specific requirement for Category 1 responders to put in place business continuity management arrangements so that if something happens that's got the ability to stop you from delivering your critical public services, you've planned for it and you're in a position to minimise its impact. So preparedness is really important. If the worst does happen, the balloon does go up and there is a major emergency or other crises in play, then it's important for your fire and rescue service to respond to it. Having dealt with response, attention then turns to how you recover from having dealt with that emergency, and then moving into the final phase of the integrated emergency management model is described as mitigation. This, in a nutshell, is about making sure that you invest time and effort in really getting to the bottom of the lessons that have been learned from dealing with that major emergency, and then feeding that learning into reviewing the various aspects of preparedness, so that on the basis of having dealt with an emergency, you're even better prepared to deal with something similar should it happen at some point in the future. So again, we end up with a virtuous circle, if this is done well, that should lead to continuous improvement in terms of your fire and rescue services preparedness and ability to respond to and recover from major emergencies and other crises. As far as the governance role of you as Fire and Rescue Authority members is concerned, well, in the same way as your officer colleagues have got a centrally important role to play in the operational and professional aspects of preparedness, response, recovery and mitigation, you as FRA members have also got a really important political governance role to play in each of those four areas. And that's what we're going to move on to now as we make our way from the first to the second part of the webinar, from theory into practice. How do you exercise really effective governance throughout each of the stages of that emergency management cycle? And we're going to start at the beginning with preparedness. The takeaway message about preparedness, unsurprisingly, is that the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. So if there are any holes in your emergency preparedness arrangements, in your business continuity arrangements, the time to address those is not when you're in the teeth of dealing with a major emergency, it's during the preparedness phase. So spending time upstream or making sure you're really well prepared is the key trick. Really important part of that process is to scrutinise, to constructively challenge business continuity plans. The Civil Contingencies Act says that you must have them. How good are they? Really important role for you as Fire Authority members to play in testing the efficacy of your business continuity plans. And in the process of doing so, be imaginative. In the questions that you ask, in the way that you explore business continuity arrangements, are the plans based on the worst case scenarios and set in the world as it really is? It was interesting that in the aftermath of the dreadful 9/11 attacks in New York, the body charged with reviewing the response to the 9/11 attacks drew a number of conclusions. And one of the headline conclusions that they drew was that the greatest enemy of effective planning for major emergencies, the greatest enemy to being really well prepared for things to go wrong, is a lack of imagination. So ever so important to be imaginative in the way you think about the sorts of things that could generate business continuity challenges for your fire and rescue services. Are risks being addressed from the different perspectives of those you represent and work with? For example, diverse communities, businesses, partner organisations, staff and trade unions. As lay people, as elected representatives, you've of course got a really important role to be the voice of those different constituencies, and thinking about the way that business continuity is being dealt with from those different perspectives is something that you can do that adds real value to the process of testing business continuity plans. Question about how quickly the plans can be deployed in response to what are called no notice, as opposed to rising tide crises. So how quickly can your service switch these plans into place? And there's a wide spectrum. If you think about the speed with which a cyber attack, which you've had no notice of, can impact on your organisation, versus the need for you to respond to wide area flooding, it's a very significant challenge, but because of the quality of weather forecasting, you're at the very least going to get quite a number of hours warning before wide area flooding starts, and there's a decent chance that you'll get several days. When it comes to cyber attack, though, that can arrive immediately and have a very significant impact. So how quickly will you be able to switch on your business continuity plans in a scenario of that sort? Again, very topical. If remote working is required, are you going to be ready for that, both as a service, but also as a fire and rescue authority? And there's three aspects. Do people have the hardware that they need? Is the software available that will enable them to conduct business remotely? And also, have people been appropriately trained in the use of this kind of technology with which we're all becoming more familiar? Continuing with this theme of scrutinising and constructively challenging business continuity plans, how can important outcomes be achieved in different ways during a crisis? For example, by using ICT and social media to engage with vulnerable groups. And this would be an obvious example where you, under normal circumstances, would be carrying out home safety checks, safe and well visits in the homes of vulnerable people. May not be possible if there's an outbreak of pandemic illness. So how can you still engage with those people and make sure that they're properly looked after by exploiting the opportunities that come with modern day technology? Really important issue here, in that the level of resilience that you have, how resistant you are to business continuity challenges, is determined to some extent by how resilient organisations are in your critical supply chains. So a question about whether they've got really good quality business continuity arrangements in place to make sure that goods and services that you really need to deliver your fire and rescue services are going to continue to be available during periods of significant challenge. Do you need to engage peer review support to secure independent professional advice on the adequacy of business continuity arrangements? So clearly your officer team will have a very high level of expertise when it comes to managing business continuity risk. You've got an important role as elected representatives to introduce constructive challenge on behalf of residents, businesses, from that layperson's perspective. At times, it may be useful to introduce independent professional challenge so that business continuity plans, business continuity arrangements are being tested from the professional perspective of peers of your senior officers. Where you think that might be a useful thing, then there is a joint local government association, National Fire Chiefs Council peer support framework, which will provide you with access to that kind of peer review support if you think it would be valuable in testing your business continuity plans. Also a question about what Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Service have had to say about business continuity arrangements last time they came to visit. And certainly if you look at any of the reports that were produced following the first tranche of inspection, they all include a section on the HMIC FRS's view on the quality of business continuity plans within fire and rescue services. So something else that's worth a look. Moving on from testing the efficacy of plan, testing the business continuity plans, or as an extension of that perhaps, ensuring that the plans are being exercised to enable people, including fire and rescue authority members where appropriate, to rehearse their roles in deploying those plans in a safe, simulated training environment. There's the old adage about plans, however well crafted they are, only surviving as long as first contact with the enemy. So by testing these plans, putting them under strain in that simulated training environment is a really good way of getting a sense of whether they're likely to work in the real world where they're required. Does the Fire and Rescue Authority's constitution, so this is certainly at the heart of governance, does your constitution allow for effective governance during periods of crisis? And there's various things to think about in this respect. One of the considerations is, how will you conduct your business as an authority, as a public body, in a constitutionally compliant way if you, as members, are unable to meet in person? Certainly an issue that you all have been dealing with over the course of the last year, and an important consideration when it comes to the way your constitution and standing orders are put together. Is there sufficient flexibility to deal with the crisis in quick time? Again, standing orders, scheme of delegation will shape the way that decisions are made in normal circumstances, but by definition, when you're dealing with a major emergency or other crises, we're not dealing with normal. So are urgent decision-making arrangements likely to be fit for purpose? Are people going to be able to make decisions in the dynamic way that they need to when responding to a major emergencies? Does the scheme of delegation have sufficient contingency to operate effectively if your officer colleagues who've got primary delegated responsibilities, your chief officer, chief fire officer, chief finance officer, and so on, when they're potentially unavailable? Is there a fallback position? And this was an important lesson that was learned by our colleagues in Derbyshire when they were dealing with the Whaley Bridge incident, very serious incident you might remember, where it looked as if a dam around a reservoir may collapse and threaten a village that was below it. So this was a really high profile, protracted and important emergency. The senior officer team were very heavily involved in dealing with the response, and as a result weren't available to make some of the decisions that the scheme of delegation assumed they would be available for under normal circumstances. Well, I'm pleased to say that the service, the authority, have learned, they've reviewed and rewritten the scheme of delegation so that they're now confident there's enough contingency in there to assign responsibility to other officers when the primary officers with those delegated responsibilities are not available. Moving from preparedness into response. So we're now in a situation where something significant is happening. First thing to say is that this is where your officer teams really come into their own. It's a centrally important part of their role to be competent at providing an effective response to emergencies and other crises. And they need to be given the space to stretch their professional legs in achieving that. Having said that though, FRA members, you will continue to have a really important role in providing political leadership and support to your officer colleagues by exercising that political leadership in your governance role on behalf of those that you represent. Some issues that you want to consider during response. First of all, I can't emphasise how important it is for senior councillor, might be the FRA chair, cabinet member in a county council service, PFCC, mayor. You need to establish really good lines of communication very early on so that there is really good alignment between the political leadership being provided by the fire authority members and the professional operational leadership being provided by your senior officer team. So early dialogue, really important. Agree arrangements for ensuring that all FRA members remain briefed about the fire and rescue service response itself if you're dealing with an emergency, and also any business continuity issues. Thinking about how best to exercise or to exploit the various communication channels that are available now to make sure that all members of the authority have their realistic expectation that they'll remain briefed fully met. Okay, so you're now actually dealing with an emergency. If your constitution is well written, then the schemes of delegation and so on should enable urgent decision-making arrangements to work effectively, but are they actually proving to be fit for purpose within the real-world context of this response? Some more issues to consider. Members working probably with your monitoring officer to examine whether the crisis is likely to impact on the Fire and Rescue Authority's agreed work programme. So there might be key decisions that are in the diary to be taken. Do you need to defer those decisions? Are you out to consultation on things like your integrated or your community risk management plans? And if so, do you need to extend those consultations to give people a reasonable opportunity to contribute their views to them and so on? So an important piece of work for members to do, probably with your monitoring officer. Under Part 2 of the Civil Contingencies Act, there is the ability for the government to introduce emergency legislation, and we've seen quite a lot of that during the COVID-19 response. So a question based on the dialogue that you're having with your officers about whether emergency legislation might be required to deal with the unique characteristics of a particular emergency. And if so, the route to that is to lobby central government through the LGA structures that are available to you as FRA members. A question about whether the national conditions of service that operational staff operate under are fit for the purpose of dealing with this emergency response. Do they need to be amended in any way to facilitate an effective response? And if so, then again, there is the ability for you as local FRA members to lobby for those kind of changes through the employer's side of the National Joint Council. The last thing to say, or at least one of the last things to say about your role during response, is that scrutiny and constructive challenge about how effectively your services have responded and how well they've managed business continuity issues is really important. In fact, it's an essential part of what you do as members. But considering the timing of that scrutiny and constructive challenge is really important. As a general principle, you will look at and make judgments about the effectiveness of the response and so on during the recovery phase. During the response phase, everybody's efforts should be focused on minimising the impact of the emergency of which are in the teeth. Having said that, if you're dealing with a crisis or a major emergency that extends over a very significant period of time, in the way that perhaps COVID-19 is, then it's not only possible, but it's likely that those lines of demarcation will be blurred. And in fact, only recently we've seen not fire and rescue authorities, but we've certainly seen the inspectorate spend time looking at how the fire and rescue service in England has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and made some judgments about that. So as a general principle, we would say that response is not the time for scrutiny and critical friendship, but that's not an absolute thing. The lines can become a bit blurred, particularly if the response phase goes on for a very long period of time. Really important for you as members to record details of your experience in the response phase for use in subsequent debriefs within your own organisations, potentially independent scrutiny and independent inspections, and potentially public inquiries. Now, we're not talking about professionally logging details of decisions that are taken and so on. What we are talking about is a far more sort of narrative version of your experience of having been involved in the response, which you may well be asked about at some point in the future. And that point in the future could be quite soon after the emergency response. But equally, in the case of public inquiries, for example, you may not be asked to recount details of your experience for quite a number of years. So it's a really good idea to capture contemporaneous notes of things that you've experienced, particularly things that you think might be important or relevant when people are asking questions about the response in the future. And then the last point I'd make as a former officer myself is that you should never underestimate the value that your officer colleagues will attach to members of their authority, their fire authority, just giving them a thank you for the work that they're doing during emergency response. Officers will often be working really long hours, frequently under arduous conditions and sometimes under really traumatic conditions, and being given a pat on the back, just a thank you for a job that's been really well done, goes a huge distance. So certainly an important part of a member's role during the emergency response phase. Okay, we're now going to move into thinking about some practical things that you might do during recovery and mitigation. The process of returning after a major emergency or other crisis to some kind of often new normal. Once again, many aspects of recovery and mitigation will be operational. Return to the new normal will therefore be dealt with by officers to a significant extent. But once again, you've really got a centrally important role in leading the process of reviewing the Fire and Rescue Service response operation, both in terms of how well the service responded if it was an emergency that the Fire and Rescue Service was expected to deal with, but also in terms of how well you managed to maintain the continuity of important business during the process of responding to the crisis. You need in that process to capture details of what worked well, to embed that good practice and make sure you share it with other organisations who really value the opportunity to learn from your experience. Equally, identify examples of what could have gone better. This is more challenging, more difficult at times, but equally important. Make sure that you explore the detail of what could have gone better and make sure that any lessons are properly learned and, most importantly, actually addressed. Things that you should consider. First of all, does a report, once the dust has settled, does a report need to be prepared for the full fire authority outlining details of the Fire and Rescue Service response, addressing any governance issues requiring what I've described there as regularisation. So even with the best constitutional arrangements, the best schemes of delegation and so on in place, it could easily be that during the course of dealing with an emergency, quick time decisions have needed to have been taken that could lead to some of those decisions not being constitutionally watertight, or at least being decisions that need to subsequently be reported to the full Fire and Rescue Authority, potentially for retrospective consideration and approval. So is it necessary to take details of how the response effort went to the full authority? As a continuation of that, should the Fire Authority establish a scrutiny exercise that enables a really deep dive to be undertaken to examine in real detail how the Fire and Rescue Service performed before reporting back to the full authority on its findings and any recommendations? So full Fire Authority meetings are good places to take decisions, but not necessarily the best places for detailed work to take place. So should there be a task and finished piece of work done, which is subsequently reported back to the authority on how well the service did in responding to the emergency? Make sure that full details of the financial cost of response have been captured and potentially claimed back through what's known as the Bellwin scheme. This is a scheme that enables local authorities and fire authorities to claim back some of the costs involved in the response phase of an emergency. Normally, there's an expectation that those claims go in within a month of the response phase finishing. So there's a really important piece of work to be done to properly cost that. The nuts and bolts of that work are clearly going to be done by your officer colleagues, but there is an important role for you in providing political oversight as that financial analysis is completed. And then the last thing to say is that in the aftermath of something very significant happening, you can end up with an awful lot of work being done to examine independently how well things had gone, all the way up to and including the government commissioning public inquiries. So that brings us to the end of the third webinar. I very much hope that we achieve what we set out to do, i.e. to provide you with some really useful food for thought in terms of how you can exercise your governance role effectively during periods of crisis. Thank you very much for taking the time to sit through this session, and I'll look forward to welcoming you to the fourth webinar in the series at some point very soon. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.